Hi, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to American Lit session 23. We're going to continue in our study of Huck Finn, remembering that this plot setting is pre-Civil War and that the book was published post-Civil War. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this day that we can come and learn more about American literature. I pray that as we learn about Huck Finn and how he chose wisely to decide that society was morally wrong, I pray that you would help us to realize that just because society has accepted something as correct, that we do not have to accept that as correct, especially if it violates God's law as written in the Bible. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Did you enjoy your first week? I know that you did. It's interesting, isn't it, that if Huck had studied the Bible, he would know slavery was morally incorrect. If he had met some real Christians, he would have known that slavery was morally incorrect. You only have to look in the Bible to find those truths that don't change. They stay the same for all people in all places at all times. Go ahead and pause the video for the devotion. You got a volunteer last week to read from the Valley of Vision. Okay, we're back. If you have not been reading from the Valley of Vision because you're doing this by yourself at home or something, I strongly suggest that you get a copy of the Valley of Vision and read one selection every week. It doesn't get much better than Valley of Vision. Schedule review. This is session 23, so we're almost to the end of the third quarter if you have 4 8-week quarters to make 32 weeks. We're going to have a quiz in a few minutes over Huck Finn chapters 1 to 18, what you read this week, and we'll be continuing to read this week from Huck Finn chapters 19 to 31. If you're in the Dover copy, it's pages 89 to 164. I know there are lots of copies out there. In the syllabus, there's no syllabus reading, but we'll be turning in the syllabus reading checklist next session. If you've lost yours by this point in time, you can go to thelmaslibrary.com and you can go to American Lit and then session 1 and find a syllabus reading checklist and print another one. We're continuing our Huck Finn paper at this time. It's time to kind of start thinking about what or who you're going to write about. And this is due session 25 in 2 weeks. I realize that we write a lot of papers in this class, but they're also all short papers. And that does seem to be the way that the experts have decided that's the way to learn how to write a paper, is to write a whole bunch of short papers. If you can write a whole stack of short papers, then you'll be able to write one long paper when you need to. Let's pause the video for the quiz. Okay, we're back. The quiz is also found at www.thelmaslibrary.com. And the quiz, once you get into American Lit, the password is there at the website, the username and the password. And once you get into Thelma's Library, the quiz is, it's not in session 23 because that is a teacher material. At this time, I don't have a way to get that to you without you sending me an email. And you can send me an email at thelma@thelmaslibrary.com. And I'll get your email and I'll send you all the teacher materials and I'll send them to you for free. You just have to convince me you're really going to use those. The third quarter exam is either next class or it is take home and do next class, or you could take it home next week and it's due the class after that. It's up to your teacher, parent, or facilitator. There are 56 questions on the exam, 125 points possible. There are 3 extra credit questions. Some classes may decide to take that exam today or send it home today. Some may decide to send that home next week. This is a shorter PowerPoint. We just have 117 slides. It is about a 1-hour quiz. And of course, it is cumulative. So expect to see questions from the first and the second quarter exams. The idea is to get you to get these things memorized so that they'll be in your mind forever. So the exam, how it is taken and when it is taken is up to your teacher or facilitator. From 101 Great American Poems, this poem is called The Day is Done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I love this poem. The day is done, and the darkness falls from the wings of night, as a feather is wafted downward from an eagle in his flight. I see the lights of the village gleam through the rain and the mist, and a feeling of sadness comes over me that my soul cannot resist, a feeling of sadness and longing that is not akin to pain and resembles sorrow only, as the mist resembles the rain. Come, read to me some poem, some simple and heartfelt lay that shall soothe this restless feeling and banish the thoughts of day. Not from the grand old masters, not from the bards sublime, whose distant footsteps echo through the corridors of time. For like strains of martial music, their mighty thoughts suggest life's endless toil and endeavor. And tonight, I long for rest. Read from some humbler poet whose songs gushed from his heart as showers from the clouds of summer or tears from the eyelids start, who through long days of labor and nights devoid of ease still heard in his soul the music of wonderful melodies. Such songs have power to quiet the restless pulse of care and come like the benediction that follows after prayer. Then read from the treasured volume the poem of thy choice, and lend to the rhyme of the poet the beauty of thy voice. And the night shall be filled with music and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like the Arabs and as silently steal away. Excuse me. We call Longfellow one of the fireside poets. He wrote about history, legends, and mythology. These poems were wildly popular. And as he is suggesting here, he wants somebody to read him, a poet, not from someone famous like Milton or John Donne or Shakespeare. He wants to read about something about history or a legend, some type of a story. And that's what this poem is suggesting. He was a famous poet during pretty much the entirety of his life, which is amazing. The Wounded Soldier. I'm going to have to pause I had to grab my Dover edition of Mark Twain's Humorous Stories and Sketches. If you have your copy right there, you can go with me to page 71. And here Twain is telling people how to tell a story. He says he doesn't claim he can tell a story as it ought to be told. I only claim to know how a story ought to be told, for I've been almost daily in the company of the most expert storytellers for many years. And now I'm going to the bottom of page 71, and this story is called The Wounded Soldier. And it's a very short story, but it's a cute story. In the course of a certain battle, a soldier whose leg had been shot off appealed to another soldier who was hurrying by to carry him to the rear, informing him at the same time of the loss which he had sustained. Whereupon the generous son of Mars, shouldering the unfortunate, proceeded to carry out his desire. The bullets and cannonballs were flying in all directions, and presently one of the latter took the wounded man's head off, without, however, his deliverer being aware of it. In no long time he was hailed by an officer who said, "Where are you going with that carcass?" "To the rear, sir. He's lost his leg." "His leg? Forsooth," responded the astonished officer. "You mean his head, you booby." Whereupon the soldier dispossessed himself of his burden and stood looking down upon it in great perplexity. At length he said, "It is true, sir, just as you said." Then after a pause he added, "But he told me it was his leg." Now, I hope you saw the humor in that, the idea that a corpse could speak. And you'll be reading this shortly. There's another funny one. It's a ghost story called The Golden Arm. It's the last story in that book. I know you'll enjoy that one too when that one gets assigned. These Mark Twain stories are really great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about punctuation before we get into our lesson for today. I have found some funny things that I've used over the year. An English professor wrote these words on the blackboard and directed his students to punctuate it correctly. So here are the words. Woman without her man is a savage. So there is the sentence, and you need to add the punctuation. Does punctuation matter? Does it count? Woman, the men wrote, all the men wrote, woman, comma, without her man, comma, is a savage. That's what the guys wrote. Okay, what did the women write? The women wrote, woman, without her, man is a savage. Which do you like better? The same words, the same sentence with different punctuation. Yes, punctuation matters. Punctuation can also save lives. What about let's eat, Grandpa, versus adding one comma. Let's eat, Grandpa. Don't you like the second one better? That's how punctuation can save lives. I like that one. A punctuation counts here is a cooking magazine, and they're talking about a famous cook, Rachel Ray. This is some years ago. Rachel Ray finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog. What's wrong with that? Just a couple of commas in cooking, comma, her family, comma, and her dog. A couple of commas would save some lives and her entire family. I like cooking my family and my pets. And here, two commas say again saves lives. I like cooking, my family, and my pets. And again, the punctuation tells us how to read the sentence. So don't forego punctuation. Again, punctuation saves lives. Hunters, please use caution when hunting pedestrians using walking trails. You like that one? Attention, toilet only for disabled, elderly, pregnant children. Thank you for shopping with us. Okay, back to Huck Finn after a little bit of fun. Why do we read Huckleberry Finn? Well, the most important thing about Huckleberry Finn is its critique of racism and its exploration of the complexities of morality and personal freedom. Do skin colors matter? And by this point in your life in 2023, hopefully you know that no, skin color doesn't matter. And hopefully you have some other skin colors in your family, a variety, so that you know people with other skin colors and realize it's just skin. Does dark skin mean a lack of intelligence, as in Huckleberry Finn? Is there more than one human race? And this really is the key and the crux of the problem. If there is more than one human race, if there's more than one race of humans, then you can have one race that is superior, that is further along on an evolutionary scale. If there's only one human race, if we go all the way back to getting off the ark with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, then we all have the same. We all have the same heritage. We are all the same. And inbreeding from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, back when the gene pool was very pure, has provided all of these variances in hair color, eye shape, facial contours, even height and bone types, hair color, and skin color. Huckleberry Finn is a coming-of-age story about a young boy named Huck who escapes his abusive father and embarks on a journey down the Mississippi River with a runaway slave named Jim. A coming-of-age story is a story about a boy or a girl who, during the course of the story, the boy becomes a man or the girl becomes a woman. We call that a coming-of-age story. And the story takes us from the beginning to the end, where that person decides what kind of person they're going to be. Along the way, Huck has to confront his own prejudices because he's been taught that slaves are lesser people. And then he has to question the moral values of the society in which he lives because he befriends Jim, and Jim turns out to be a father figure to Huck and his best friend. And Jim protects Huck. He protects him from danger. He even protects him from things that he doesn't think Huck is able to find out about yet. He protects him from some things that might hurt Huck. Is society correct or immoral? Huck has to decide. Is society correct? Now, we're talking about Mississippi society here. We're not talking about Oregon or California, where slavery was not really a thing. We're talking about Mississippi. Is Mississippi in the 1860s, is that society correct, or is that society what is immoral? And of course, we know the answers, but through the character of Huck Finn, Mark Twain is going to teach us. And then 1860s or 1880, 85, readers reading this might be able to come to the same conclusion that they are foolish, that their morality is actually immoral. Through Huck's experiences, Twain exposes the hypocrisy and the cruelty of slavery and racism, not the cruelty so much because he's Mark Twain, and the racism in America during this pre and post Civil War era. He also explores themes of the power of conscience. What can your conscience do for you? And Huck's conscience told him that the other people were wrong and that Jim shouldn't be a slave, and the conflict between societal expectations and personal morality. Huck knew what society expected of him. He was expected to turn Jim in, but he has a personal morality formed on basically nothing but intuition and instinct. And from getting to know Jim as a person, he knows that it's morally wrong for Jim to remain a slave. Will Huck choose wisely, reject slavery, and help Jim escape? And I think you can guess what he's going to do. Libraries and groups are offended still by Twain's offensive language. Would the book have been as effective without that language, especially because the N word, N-I, double E-R, that word now can get you fired from your job, just saying the word. If the word is found in your past or something like that, you can get fired for that. And there's still people in the South who were using that word 10 years ago, and they had to clean that up out of their vocabularies. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, it hasn't been so much of a thing unless you go downtown Portland, where we seem to find most of the racists in Oregon. But would that book have been as effective without that language? And we're thinking in 1880s. And are you able to read a book from the 1880s and judge it correctly and read it and not use the language? Does the language trump the book's challenge to readers? Is it more important for you to read the book or to hide the words? Twain is still inspiring readers to challenge moral wrongs that society has deemed morally correct. And that's interesting in 2023, isn't it? Because our society has deemed all types of horrific things to be morally correct, all types of aberrant behaviors that our society now calls morally correct. And do you have what it takes to know that that is morally incorrect? But of course, as a theist, you have the truth as found in the Bible. So it's pretty clear and easy to find what is correct and what is not. Even slavery, a correct reading of the Bible says slavery is, of course, wrong. All right, we're going to pick up our structured notes from where we left off last week. And the whole idea of the structured notes is to give you ideas that will help you to write your paper. Okay, you know that the author is Mark Twain. His real name is Samuel Clemens. He lived from 1835 to 1910. Would you like to learn a little bit about Twain's family? There are just a few rare pictures of he and his family somewhere online. I think you could find it Mark Twain video, and you could see a video of Mark Twain. Most of what you'll find if you look for Mark Twain video is the Mark Twain impersonator, Mark Twain Tonight. He looked like Twain, dressed like Twain, and earned his living from talking like Twain and making jokes like Twain. But there is one actual video of Twain. Video was very, very early then. We know a little bit about Twain's family. He wrote about them, and there are just a few pictures. Twain, we know that he says he fell in love with Olivia at first sight in 1868, and they got married in 1870. Their son Langdon died of diphtheria at 19 months old. This was really common back then to lose babies and children. This is before vaccinations for diphtheria and typhoid and these type of fevers, rubella, whooping cough. These were real diseases that people had to deal with. Shown here are daughters Susie, Clara, and Jean. These are his daughters. Hannibal City, we know, was the model for St. Petersburg in Huckleberry Finn, which is kind of fun that this place where he grew up, that became the model for St. Petersburg. You know, we write about what we know. So the fictional town that Huckleberry Finn lives in or begins in is based on his hometown of Hannibal. Missouri, what do you know about Missouri? This is a slave state as a result of that Missouri Compromise we talked about last week. Now, the Mason-Dixon line prohibited slavery beyond 36 degrees latitude. This compromise was intended to maintain the balance of power between the free and the slave states. Remember the 11 free states and the 11 slave states. And there's Missouri right on the Mason-Dixon line, you can tell from this picture. Now in Missouri, most slaves worked as domestic servants, like household staff, rather than on the large plantations that most slaves experienced further south. In Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, we were looking at slavery mostly. We started in Kentucky, but we were mostly looking way deep down in Louisiana, where it's hot and sweltering, and slaves were picking cotton and would have a shorter lifespan because of what they did. Mark Twain is going to try and make his point through humor. So his slaves are way up here in Missouri, which is the area that he knows most well also. And so his slaves are basically household staff. But of course, if somebody dies, they can still be sold, and they can certainly be sold downriver. And that's a threat to Jim, that someone thought about selling him downriver. So his slaves aren't quite in the predicament that the slaves further south are, except for the point of, obviously, family separation was happening all the time. In fact, Clement's own family owned slaves. Not Clement himself, but his family, as he was growing up, owned some slaves. Now, this less offensive style of slavery, that's a thing, if you can say any kind of slavery is less offensive, but I do believe that that's true. The slavery on a plantation and the slavery as household staff, I think, is different. Not much better, but much better as far as treatment. As far as what it does to your soul, I don't think it would be any better. But this is the kind of slavery Twain describes in Huckleberry Finn. Even when the action occurs in the Deep South, he still has the slavery as the milder type that you would see up in Missouri. And this enables the readers to laugh at the story without vicarious suffering, as in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where you couldn't laugh at any kind of slavery because every page brought some new kind of misery. The peculiar institution, as slavers called it, figures prominently in Twain's novel. And it's important in developing both the theme and the two most important characters, which are Huck and Jim. Slavery is shown to be ludicrous through humor and irony. The character Huck is the one who's ignorant, and he's unaware of the dark sin inherent in slavery. The ignorant but wise character of Jim's ignorant because he's never gone to school, and he's very superstitious, which creates humor in Huckleberry Finn. But this character of Jim makes slavery's sin apparent. He misses his family. He doesn't want to go down south, but that makes slavery's sin apparent. But his superstitious day-to-day behavior creates a lot of humor. We're not going to see slavery as we saw it in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mark Twain has a different agenda to make you decide that slavery is wrong. He's going to show it to be ridiculous. The Mississippi River is the perfect plot element. Think about it. If you're writing a novel, what better plot element could you have than a river where the main characters get on a raft and then stop from place to place to place to place and have an adventure at each place? So the river was the main artery of slave transportation, and so that's a scary place for a runaway slave like Jim. The river also provides a perfect avenue for plot development as Jim and Huck stop from one town to the next, stopping for different adventures in each town. However, as Jim soon figures out, they are heading downriver. And if you're a slave in the 1860s or 80s, even, it's not a good place to be. And of course, anyone you meet along the river is going to think they could snatch Jim and either get the reward for turning him back in or resell him as a slave and make a lot of money. Now, Twain uses satire to expose the social ills of his day. He wants to make everybody laugh. He uses the vernacular of this unschooled boy, Huck, and this ignorant yet wise slave, Jim, to make fun of religious hypocrites, especially those who support oppression of African Americans. Look at the very beginning of the book. Right on the inside front page, there's a notice. Persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot by order of the author, per GG, Chief of Ordnance. So poor Mark Twain tried to make sure that nobody would use it in school and make people write papers from it. And I'm really sorry that you have to do that, but it's history for us, and so you must. But remember, you can write it on tree bark if we can read it. Twain's irony. He uses irony, saying one thing, but he actually means the opposite of what the literal definition is. And we're going to see that over and over and over again. He's using irony humorously, covering this declaration of the book's seriousness in a joke. Huckleberry Finn is the protagonist of the novel, the main character. He's the narrator of the novel, and that's why the grammar is so pathetic. And the vernacular, the common language of Huck and Jim is so sorry. And so now I know my boys, 20 some, nearly 30 years ago at this point, that when they were reading Huckleberry Finn, their grammar got horrific and terrible. And they thought it was just a blast to be able to write the paper with Huck's style, because grammar didn't count and spelling didn't count. It just counted that you were creative and made your word count and used the right number of quotes. So Huck is our narrator all for fun. And he is a classic noble savage character. He's ignorant, he's uneducated, he's been raised just by Pat, but mostly he's raised himself. So he's done very little school. So he really doesn't know what to think. And he's so practical. He thinks literally. And so he makes fun of romanticism, the types of stories that his friend Tom Sawyer reads that are filled with faraway places. He doesn't remember, Huck doesn't even believe in elephants because he's never seen an elephant. So he doesn't believe in it. He doesn't believe in genies. He doesn't believe in Arabs. He doesn't believe in anything he's never seen or met. And so he makes fun of all of these things that are common in romantic stories. And I think this is Twain's way of making fun of all of these romantic stories. So Huck is very much a literalist. He takes everything literally. Huck's society was hypocritical. They were unjust, they were blind, and they were ignorant. That's the statement Samuel Clemens is making to the world through satire in Huck Finn. The negative aspects of Huck's character come from his exposure to civilization. He's a noble, savage character, very much like what Freud thought in his essay. I mentioned this at least once before, Civilization and Its Discontents. If you look up Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, I don't know how long that would be if you printed it. It might be 5 or 10 pages to print and read. And I think a high school student would be able to read it easily. You certainly could find Freud at any library. It's not dirty reading by any stretch. And you could see what he said about society. He really believes that the underlying problem with society is the influence of Christianity on society. Christianity has incorrectly, thinks Clemens, incorrectly taught society that some things are bad and some things are good, and they're simply wrong. And so society, the more of society you have in you, the the least worth you have as a real person who's able to actually do any good. But that's the point Samuel Clemens is making. And so the negative aspects of Huck's character are from his exposure to civilization. Definitely a noble, savage character. You can point that out if you're writing a character study of Huck. Huck's conflict in the story is between what society says is right, because slavery is legal. So society says slavery is right. Why do they think slavery is right? Of course, it's mostly about money, but why do they also say it's morally correct? You have to have, you've got to have a Darwinian interpretation of mankind to say that is correct. And so he has to decide, is what society say, is that what's correct? Or is what his moral conscience tells him is correct? And what Twain is trying to convince his readers is to follow their moral conscience and know that slavery is evil, that your moral conscience tells you that these slaves are just people who are ignorant because they're uneducated and they have a different culture because they're from a different part of the world, but that slavery is evil. Twain uses an ignorant boy to make his point. The world is wrong. Remember, Twain is living in a hypocritical world. They're all hypocrites. Of course, we're all hypocrites, but this is extremely hypocritical. His world says blacks are inferior and should be subjugated. Now, Jim is a great character. I hope you love Jim by now. This is a famous scene from Huck Finn when Tom Sawyer says they simply have to do things by the book. And so Jim has to be locked up. And also by the book means he has to have snakes and mice and critters in there with him. He has to be absolutely miserable. And poor Jim goes along with it because he's so ignorant. He doesn't know any better. And of course, it's ridiculous and silly, even that he would go along with it. But it is very funny, creates a lot of humor. So Jim is an escaped slave. Remember, Miss Watson thought about selling him downriver and separating his family. He's probably the best developed character in the novel besides Huck. He certainly is the best father figure in the book. And it's interesting that Huck's father is whiter than white, and he's the worst example of a father that you could ever imagine. And Jim is a runaway slave and his skin is black, and he's the best example of a father in the book. And I think that's on purpose that Twain does that. Twain's best friend from childhood, John Lewis, was the inspiration for Jim. So Twain's best friend from the time he was a little boy is a black man who was named John Lewis. Jim is an escaped slave. He runs into Huck on Jackson's Island. He's hiding out, and the two instantly become friends and spend most of the rest of the novel together. And the two of them together create all types of wonderful stories and conflict. Jim misses his wife and two children, and he dreams of getting them back. And that's kind of a little bit of reality for us. Through Jim, Twain makes a slave a real person for the reader, kind of like Stowe did with Eliza and Tom, just not to the extent that Stowe did. But we find out enough about Jim that we realize, wow, he doesn't even get to run away with his family. Now, the Duke and the Dauphin, these are one of the many subplots that are absolutely great. They're just these hucksters and these criminals that take advantage of Huck's ignorance. The Duke says he's the Duke of Bridgewater, and the other guy says he's the Dauphin, the Duke of Bridgewater. And of course, the Dauphin will sarcastically call him Bilgewater instead of Bridgewater, and that just drives Bridgewater, his fake name, just drives him nuts. Now, these characters provide comedy because everybody knows they're scammers, and Huck seems to go along with it at first, whether he really believes they are who they are, or whether they get away with it because they're adults or because he's afraid that they'll turn in Jim. We don't really know, but Huck goes along with it for a while, and they provide quite a bit of comedy because they're such hucksters. Now, the Dauphin, if you're not familiar with it, is the title given to heirs of the French throne. So the Dauphin is the son of the king who's going to be the king. Now, the Dauphin, son of Louis XVI, the executed French king, is who the Dauphin here in our story pretends to be. The Dauphin is called the king, and we never really learn their real names. They're just called the Duke and the Dauphin. Now, Louis XVI lived from 1754 to 1793. So it's quite a stretch. We tend to think it's hundreds of years, but it's really, what is that, about it's close to 100 years too early. So the Dauphin would have to be, more than 100 years old. So it's quite ridiculous. But that's the thing that he uses. Now, we read about tar and feathers in chapter 33. And just so the reader understands how serious this is in old novels and in the old times. If the public wanted to take care of a huckster, somebody themselves, they all got together. They went and got the guy, and they tar and feathered him and rode him on a rail out of town. But to actually tar and feather somebody means they cover them in hot tar oil, which burns the skin and makes it so the skin can't breathe, and that alone can kill you. And then they put feathers all over them while the tar is hot, and that's called tar and feather. But the oil burns. It removes skin with it when they peel it off. If the victim lives, they're peeling the skin as they remove that. It's just as bad as a really bad burn. This is an angry mob punishment for somebody who's tricked the entire town and made fools of them. And that's why they were tar and feathered. This is a modern version from the 1950s, somebody who had been tarred and feathered. It's pretty bad. And here is somebody who's been tarred and feathered, and they're riding him out of town on a rail. When they say riding a rail, they put the victim on a rail and they parade him through town and then out of town while everybody laughs and jeers at them. And people stand on either side so they can't fall off. And they bob along the way, putting them on this rail. And the idea is that the crotch is damaged or even split to cause severe injury, so the person never will walk normally again. So this is really a vicious punishment that these people get. Now, the Duke and the King, another tiny subplot, is when the Duke and the King pose as heirs to an estate and then sell the family of slaves. And this gives readers a glimpse of reality. They pretend to be these lost uncles, and the girls just fall in love with him, and then he takes over with their finances and rips them off. But the slaves get sold. The mother is sent to New Orleans, and then her sons are sent to Memphis. This is just horrible. And the idea is that even nice people like these girls sell their slaves. They don't even think about it. Now, Tom Sawyer. If you have time, you might read Tom Sawyer on the side. You could read him in one evening or a couple of evenings if you want to catch up and find out all about Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer is the one that likes Becky, and they find gold in a cave, and there's real robbers and quite a bit of excitement in that book too. But Tom is Huck's very selfish, civilized friend. He's gone to school and he's read a lot of books, and he lives in his own world. He lives in his own childish boy world instead of the practical world that Huck lives. Huck kind of lives in reality, whereas Tom lives in his imagination through all the books he's read. And Tom is trying to live out stories from romantic themed books about pirates and robbers. And Tom is the protagonist of Tom Sawyer, and he acts as a literary foil to Huck Finn in this book. So Twain uses Tom Sawyer to scorn literary romanticism. He's kind of making fun of books about faraway places and unrealistic results, where princesses are captured by pirates and then fall in love and live happily ever after. Mark Twain didn't like that type of story, and he's making fun of that. But Tom, who's read all the books, insists on doing things by the book. And the reader knows those things are wrong, but Huck doesn't seem to know any better. Twain uses Tom's character to scorn the civilization of his own day. This image is from Tom Sawyer when they're in the cave and they've discovered this gold, and there's bad guys in the cave and lots of adventure. Tom is identified with the civilization from which Huck is alienated. Tom's insistence upon practicing his foolish notions of right and wrong ways, like the things they did to Jim when they put him in the shed, reflects Twain's scorn for civilization. This is typical of both realism and naturalism. These two flavors of romanticism. Realism is the initial form, and then as it gets a little worse, it gets into naturalism. But this is Twain's way of scorning civilization. The widow Douglas and Miss Watson are two wealthy sisters. The widow Douglas wants to civilize Huckleberry. Watson is a religious hypocrite, and Twain uses these characters to scorn the religious hypocrisy that he sees in proper society. Now, Miss Watson is the older, stricter sister. The widow Douglas is a little nicer. She's taking care of Huck when the story begins. Miss Watson is the one who thinks about selling Jim downriver, and that's why Jim runs away. But don't worry, she's going to change her mind at the end of the book. Pap. Pap is the town drunk. He's illiterate, he's cruel, he's a fierce racist, and he's just a disgusting, wicked, evil person. And he's very superstitious. When Huck gets some money, Pap wants to get that money, and he just wants to get it for alcohol. And that's why Huck actually takes his money to the judge, because he wants to say he has no money. He doesn't want Pap to be able to get his money. Pap is angry that Huck is getting educated. He doesn't want him to go to school. He doesn't want his son. He throws a book in front of him and says, read it. Oh my goodness, so it's true. You can read. Like, that's the worst thing in the world. Crazy, isn't it? But Twain here is using irony. Pap believes that Black people are incapable of intelligence and shouldn't be able to vote. That's in the book. And the audience knows Jim is the father figure that Huck needs, and that Pap is the person incapable of intelligence. He's drank his brain into the toilet, and Pap is the one who shouldn't be voting. He doesn't know anything. So it's very much irony. Through Pap, Twain scorns the Jim Crow laws of the 1880s. Now, remember, we looked at Jim Crow laws last week. This book is published 20 years after the Civil War, and the Jim Crow laws have already begun. The book is published in 85. These Jim Crow laws are really well entrenched in places like Mississippi. This attitude and denying Blacks the right to vote and an education lingered around for 100 years after the Civil War in southern states, until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Amazing, isn't it? Until they removed those Jim Crow laws. Really amazing. The Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, Twain presents them as the best of society. The best society has to offer in the slave states. And so he's really making fun of the best people, because they're really quite foolish. This is making a statement through irony, really typical to Twain. These families are hate-loving, trigger-happy killers that are mixed up in this feud that's been going on forever against each other. They can't even remember why they started the feud. And there's some sad things that have to be dealt with in this part of the story. The Grangerfords are in a feud with the Shepherdsons, though nobody can even remember the cause of the feud or see any real reason to continue it. This is really the sad part of the story, is the Grangers. Emmeline Grangerford, this is so funny. She's dead. We never meet her. She's dead, and her crayon pictures are all over the wall, and they're all really morbid. And so apparently she had a really morbid fascination. And she probably, I've read a lot of commentaries on this, she probably is Mark Twain making fun of Emily Dickinson, because she had quite a morbid fascination with death. Do you remember Emily Dickinson writing about death all the time? That was just what she did. Remember your 101 American Poems on page 29, I could not stop for death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So death here is personified like a gentleman. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children played, their lessons scarcely done. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Okay, so now it's going to get chilly, right? This is your leisurely journey, probably in a hearse on the way to be buried. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible. The cornice but a mound, so her new house is going to be just a burial ground with a little bump. Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So she's been dead for quite a long time. And I think that this tells us, I think Emily Grangerfield tells us what Mark Twain thought about Emily Dickinson. That's what I think. Okay, what about the Phelps family? Aunt Sally, Uncle Silas, and their children. These characters, Twain uses them to make fun of the people and their bigotry toward Black people. Aunt Sally is a bigot, of course. This is the 1880s. And what's a bigot? It's a person who's utterly intolerant of any differing creed, belief, or opinion. And of course, somebody who thinks Black people should all be slaves and are ignorant and stupid is a bigot. Of course, that gets used very widely today. You and I, as Christians, are called bigots now because we're seen to be intolerant of other views. Okay, what kind of literary devices are we going to see in Huckleberry Finn? Well, definitely we see that Twain, the mark of Twain, the use of humor and irony to make a point. He says one thing, but he really means the opposite of its literal meaning. Irony is used humorously to cover the serious issues that he addresses in Huck Finn. Most of the ironic situations are from Huck's youth and gullibility. He's very gullible because he takes people literally and he just kind of believes everybody. He shouldn't, but he believes what everybody says is true. An example of irony is given when Tom tells Huck about his new gang. Huck says, "Oh, but Tom Sawyer, he hunted me up and said he was going to start a band of robbers, and I might join him if I would go back to the widow and be respectable." Now, that's humor through irony, because if he goes back to the widow and is respectable, then you're certainly not going to join a band of robbers. The gap between the thing or the words expected and the thing that actually happens or is said, that's how you create humor when it's presented just right. And Twain was famous for presenting things just right. When the widow says grace, Huckleberry calls it grumbling. Huck thinks the nice clothes she gives him are just stifling. He thinks heaven is dull and he'd prefer to go to hell if his friend Tom is going to be there. The widow Douglas and her sister, Miss Watson, we call this type of a character a stock character. They basically represent anybody in society and what's wrong with it. So they're very artificial, whereas Huck is more sincere. They wear tight collars. Through Huck's ignorant eyes, their society and religion are absolutely just absurd. They're ridiculous. They're hypocrites. And religion, unfortunately, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, appears to think that all religious people are hypocrites, and that's kind of sad. So the religious people in his books, we would expect, they, of course, are extreme hypocrites. Twain's superstition and pessimism show through clearly in Miss Watson. Twain himself is pessimistic and he's superstitious. Both things, of course, common to non-Christians of that era. There's not one sincere Christian in this book. His superstition and pessimism are really clear. He's making fun of superstition, but he's superstitious himself. The widow Douglas describes a wonderful God, while Miss Watson's is terrible. And so Huck concludes there are two gods. And of course, that creates humor. Now, I have a really good book. It's called The Bible According to Mark Twain, and it is just a remarkable book. It gave me a lot of insight into Twain. And so I've got some quotes here for you. His own intellectual development from the fundamentalist Presbyterian of the Hannibal Sunday School to a deism molded by Tom and Paine's The Age of Reason, and later modified by the evolutionary determinism of Darwin and his followers, because Twain, of course, is after Darwin. He's even living at the same time as Sigmund Freud, the guy who wrote Civilization and Its Discontents. So if he's reading widely, he's reading all these guys. And that places Mark Twain in the mainstream of the 19th century conflict between science and religion. We tend to think of Mark Twain as being a long time ago, but he really is in the middle of this period. when everything about the Bible is being challenged. Hence, these writings also form an important literary reflection of that conflict, which in some respects continues today. Church in Huck Finn, what does he think about church? Tom Sawyer tells Huck all about angering genies. You don't want to make genies angry. And Tom Sawyer says, oh, why, whoever rubs the lamp or the ring, they belong to whoever rubs the lamp or the ring. And they've got to do whatever he says. If he tells them to build a palace 40 miles long out of diamonds and fill it full of chewing gum or whatever you want, and fetch an emperor's daughter from China for you to marry, they've got to do it. The genie has to do it. And they've got to do it before sunup next morning, too. And more, they've got to waltz that palace around over the country wherever you want it. You understand? Well, says I think they're a pack of flatheads for not keeping the palace themselves instead of fooling them away like that. And so the genie's foolish for not keeping the palace himself. And what's more, if I was one of them, if he was a genie, I would see a man in Jericho before I would drop my business and come to him for the rubbing of an old tin lamp. He very literal and matter of fact. How you talk, Huck Finn. Why, you'd have to come when he rubbed it, whether you wanted to or not. What? An eye as high as a tree and as big as a church? All right, then I would come. But I lay I'd make that man climb the highest tree there was in the country. Shucks, it ain't no use to talk to you, Huck Finn. You don't seem to know anything somehow. Perfect saphead, says Tom Sawyer. I thought all this over for 2 or 3 days, and then I reckoned I would see if there was anything in it. I got an old tin lamp and an iron ring and went out in the woods and rubbed till I sweat like an Injun, calculating to build a palace and sell it, but it weren't no use. None of the genies come. So then I judged that all that stuff was only just one of Tom Sawyer's lies. I reckon he believed in the Arabs and the elephants. But as for me, I think different. It had all the marks of a Sunday school. That's from the end of chapter 3. And sometimes we read that and we miss that part. That's right at the end of chapter 3. It had all the marks of a Sunday school. So it's a story that isn't true. So I slid out and slipped off up the road, and there weren't anybody at the church, except maybe a hog or two. Now, this is more about church and Huck Finn, for there weren't any lock on the door, and hogs likes a puncheon floor in summertime because it's cool. If you notice, most folks don't go to church only when they've got to, but a hog is different. And that's when Huck goes to get Miss Sophia's Testament that she left behind at church. His view of church again. They serve as foils for each other. What's a literary foil? That's a character whose personality and attitude is the opposite of the personality and attitude of another character. So, for example, Robin is a foil to Batman, that type of thing. So you've got your backup character here who makes our character Huck, kind of shows off his character. So Tom Sawyer's a foil for Huck Finn. Per Twain's philosophy, the hypocrisy of the sisters make Huck's naturalistic qualities seem better than the qualities found in society. Twain uses the hypocrites to show the superiority of Huck's philosophy of school, society, and religion. A writer presents opposites to make one look better by comparison. And so by making fun of Tom Sawyer and his belief in genies and his living in that imaginary world of pirates and robbers and things, he's really making fun of people who believe in real religion and the religion of the Bible. Tom's romanticism is a foil for Huck's naturalism. Huck is a literalist. The reader will prefer Huck's simplicity and sincerity. Huck makes Tom seem more comical, and Tom makes Huck seem more practical. That's what literary foils do. Huck is ignorant, immature, and inconsiderate. Jim acts as a foil to Huck because he balances out Huck's bad qualities. Jim provides adult wisdom, sincere humanity, and a voice of reason to balance Huck's immaturity, inconsiderate nature, and thoughtlessness. So Jim has the things that Huck doesn't have. He's a sincere person and he's a voice of reason. Jim's story provides the plot. because Jim is a runaway slave and running from place to place, but it happens when they get in the river that they're going down river, and that doesn't help Jim's situation. But Jim is the one who motivates the characters and moves the action from one place to another. Without him, the story wouldn't have any climax. Huck wouldn't have something that he had to think at the end of the day. What am I going to do about Jim? I'm running away with Jim, but what am I going to do? Huck is our narrator in the dialect of a young of a young Southern boy, a kid from Missouri. Society, and I think Huck believes this, and this is probably what Twain believes, that society stifles freedom. Manners, restrictive clothing, religion, all of those things stifle freedom. Twain doesn't trust society. Remember, what's he doing? He's walking around in white when everybody else is wearing black. He's doing the opposite of what other people do. Excuse me. Excuse me. He does not believe that you need religion to be moral. Twain's thinking is very Freudian, and their lifespans, you can see how much they overlap. So it would not be inconceivable that Twain has read some Freud. Certainly Darwin. In the beginning note, Twain tells us that his characters are all going to speak in dialects, regional or ethnic variants of English, and we call this the vernacular. For example, students today have a vernacular where they use lots and lots of acronyms, especially with texting. You know, FYI is an acronym for your information, and students today talk with lots of that kind of thing. That would be a 2023 vernacular. And Huck had his own. This makes the book more believable because he talks like kids would have talked then. This is part of the story's realism. It's a non-romantic, a non-idealistic picture of the world. Huck has a bad father who's looking to take his money. There are bad people. There are shysters, hucksters, criminals out to get you. Okay, what about making a statement with a bad word? And this is how Huck Finn gets pulled from the shelves. How do you make that statement? Well, to begin with, we're going back 150 years ago. The this word is from a corrupt racist society. We have to remember that Twain condemns slavery, and of course, this word in his mockery of civilization. But that's what the word is. That's what the word was. That's what it is. It's out there. It's still all over some music. Do you really ban the book for that word? He uses this word mockingly. But I do suggest if you're reading this aloud at home that you substitute something else for that obscenity. Choose something like blockhead, something, or stupid head. Blockhead is a pretty good one. Even that you probably don't want your 3 or 4-year-old going around calling people blockheads, but you can think of something that you can stand coming out of a 3 or 4-year-old's mouth. Poking fun at romanticism, we already discussed this. Through the character of Tom, Twain pokes fun at romantic literature, things that are just not realistic. So Twain obviously shows his preference here for realism. Tom insists that all his make-believe adventures have to be conducted by the book, which of course is ridiculous in real life. But he gets many of his ideas from fiction. In particular, Tom tries to imitate romantic novels, things that are not realism, pirates and cowboys and Indians. And of course, Twain scorns that type of romantic novel. Tom values the literature of civilization. Huck is as skeptical of it as he is of religion. Twain lumps genies and prayers all together in one lump because neither produce results in his mind. Twain speaks through Huck to show his own rejection. He gets away with it because it's funny. Now, think about when they're forming Tom Sawyer's gang. They say, now, we'll start this band of robbers and call it Tom Sawyer's Gang. Everybody that wants to join has got to take an oath and write his name in blood. Everybody was willing. So Tom got out a sheet of paper that he had wrote the oath on and read it. It swore every boy to stick to the band and never tell any of the secrets. And if anybody done anything to any boy in the band, whichever boy was ordered to kill that person and his family must do it. And he mustn't eat and he mustn't sleep till he had killed them and hacked a cross on their breasts, which was the sign of the band. And nobody that didn't belong to the band could use that mark. And if he did, he must be sued. And if he'd done it again, he must be killed. And if anybody that belonged to the band told the secrets, he must have his throat cut and then have his carcass burned up and the ashes scattered all around, and his name blotted off the list with blood and never mentioned again by the gang, but have a curse put on it and be forgot forever. Everybody said it was a real beautiful oath, and asked Tom if he got it out of his own head. He said some of it, but the rest was out of pirate books and other robber books, and every gang that was high toned had it. Some thought it would be good to kill the families of the boys that told the secrets. Tom said it was a good idea, so he took a pencil and wrote it. Then Ben Rogers says, "Here's Huck Finn. He ain't got no family. What you gonna do about him?" "Well, ain't he got a father?" says Tom Sawyer. "Yes, he's got a father, but you can't never find him these days. He used to lay drunk with the hogs in the tan yard, but he ain't been seen in these parts for a year or more." They talked it over, and they were going to rule me out because they said every boy must have a family or somebody to kill, or else it wouldn't be fair and square for the others. Well, nobody could think of anything to do. Everybody was stumped and sat still. I was almost ready to cry, but all at once I thought of a way, and so I offered him Miss Watson. They could kill her. Everybody said, "Oh, she'll do. That's all right. Huck can come in." Then they all stuck a pin in their fingers to get blood and sign with, and I made my mark on the paper. "Now," says Ben Rogers, "what's the line of business of this gang?" "Nothing, only robbery and murder," Tom said. "But who are we going to rob? Houses or cattle or the stuff?" "Stealing cattle and such things ain't robbery, it's burglary," says Tom Sawyer. "We ain't burglars. That ain't no sort of style. We are highwaymen. We stop stages and carriages on the road with masks on and kill the people and take their watches and money." "Must we always kill the people?" "Oh, certainly it's best. Some authorities think different, but mostly it's considered best to kill them, except some that you bring to the cave here and keep them till they're ransomed." "Ransomed? What's that?" "I don't know, but that's what they do. I've seen it in the books. And so, of course, that's what we've got to do." "But how can we do it if we don't know what it is?" "Why, blame it all, we've got to do it. Don't I tell you it's in the books? Do you want to go to be doing different from what's in the books and get things all muddled up?" I hope you enjoy Huckleberry Finn. It is really a kick. It can be hard to read aloud in front of little kids, but it is quite a kick. Okay, what about Black and White in 1885? Remember, the novel is staged. The setting is pre-Civil War, but it was actually published later in 1885. This is Mark Twain with his best friend, John, whatever his last name is. It'll come up again. Although born and raised in Missouri, Twain vehemently opposed slavery. He witnessed the inhumane treatment of Blacks and openly criticized the barbaric institution of slavery. So how does one person do something? You write a book. In an 1885 letter sent to Francis Wayland, the dean of Yale University Law School, which was publicized in the New York Times, Twain sought reparations for former slaves. This is really unique in 1885. He wrote, and the paper published, "We've ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." So Twain was an early pioneer in this movement as the debate over compensating former slaves continues to rage into the 21st century. Really amazing, isn't it? And nobody knows exactly how to do reparations correctly. You should talk with your parents, talk with your pastor, and see what they say. This is really a hot topic. Despite Twain's hatred of racism in chapter 4, he allows Jim to tell us that Pap had two angels on either side of him, one good and one evil. Remember, that's a common literary convention familiar to any cartoon fan. One angel was black, one white. This would seem to be in keeping with an even more common literary convention, which is really tough, of black and white, the identification of goodness with the color white and badness with the color black. And that's really unfortunate because those are usually the best metaphors that we can come up with. This convention is exemplified in everyday references to somebody's, like, their dark side or Christians understand this as a spiritual blindness, a spirit to be spiritually dark, to live in darkness without the light. Jesus is the light, John 14. And so they're blind to the light that way. And I think that that goes back to us calling skin color black and white, because I'm not white, and the black people that I know aren't really black. So I think it's really hard because we've identified people's skin with color, that then that carries over into the metaphors that we use. When describing pap, Twain refers to pap's skin as a white to make a body sick, a white to make a body's flesh crawl. So I think we can think of pap as a very uh, non-normal, pasty, a guy who lives in the darkness, which again is where crimes are committed, who very rarely gets up during the day, and a person whose liver is probably not functioning very well anymore. And so he's sickly white, but it makes your body's flesh crawl. Throughout the novel, the most decent, the most moral character is Jim. Jim's the best friend figure, and he's the best father figure. Jim will spare Huck from all types of things. Jim is really like a father, and he puts his own worries aside to care for Huck. Twain purposely uses opposite expectations to make his point that the black runaway slave is the good father figure, and the sickly white man is the horrid white character. Amazing, really, what he does with black and white. It's kind of cool. Twain uses white for bad and black for good. He understands the difference between intelligence and education. This quote is from chapter 5, page 14 in the Dover edition, about the white sickness, ill looking. Twain's realism: Huck learns to break away from society's norms to do what is right. He develops his own conscience. This is a coming of age story. He develops his own conscience and learns what he thinks is right and what he thinks is wrong. He has a natural sense of right and wrong. One who's alienated from society can figure out right and wrong more easily. And I think that's what Twain's point is that if you get away from people and just live with people that don't think the way society thinks, you'll figure things out for yourself better. Society teaches blacks are inferior and slavery is right. And Huck discovers that the opposite is what is true. The climax of the story, this is in your Dover copy, pages 161 and 62. If you want to mark it now or put something there, Huck writes a letter to Miss Watson, and he's going to tell her where Jim is. But then his conscience pricks him, and he makes this decision, and he says, all right then, I'll go to hell. And that's when that's when he resolves to steal Jim out of slavery. That's the climax of the story. He has this battle going on inside him, and he just finally decides, because society says it's bad, that you've got to turn Jim in or you're a bad person. And so it's Twain's use of irony. All right then, I'll go to hell. He's going to help Jim escape. And that is the end of our story time telling today. The Lord bless you, and I will see you next week. Have fun with your reading.